Welcome to the podcast, Holly.
How's it going? It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, looking back when you connect the dots, maybe even all the way to your upbringing, what has made you to become the VC you are right now at Mangusta Capital as its investment partner?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, generally I have an interesting sort of background, sort of less cookie cutter sort of rate to VC, but in general, I think, from time I was a kid, I was always kind of entrepreneurial. It was always sort of like starting small, like little businesses with my friends or, like had kind of like big ambitions to start things or, we were always sort of like dreaming and, kind of always had that in the back of my mind. But at the same time, my parents and older siblings were always, very practical and, sort of like, we're like, you should go to medical school and like, you should, or be a lawyer or, do something like that. So, that kind of, pushed me in that direction for a long time. And, was really deep in the process of, going to medical school at one point, but sort of pivoted and found myself in VC. So whenever I was in school, I was a biology major. My brother's a doctor, he's 10 years older than me. So, kind of like a role model in some ways. He was like, go to medical school, it's great. And, I always had some, I guess, inkling towards like math and science as well. So, from some respects, like it made sense. And I liked, those subjects and, obviously being a doctor is an incredible profession, but I went the whole way through, got my degree in biology, ended up, moving right after school to do research, actually down at where I'm based now in Miami at the University of Miami, health system, and was doing research for a year, kind of, preparing myself for medical school, doing the applications, took the MCAT the whole way through, got into medical school, and then decided, hey, I really don't want to do this. And, it was kind of like a big, monumental sort of life moment, kind of telling my parents like, hey, I don't think I want to do this. And, I've done all this work sort of to get up to this point, but, I want to do something different. I don't want to, spend the next 4 years in med school and then residency. I want to kind of like do something on my own. It's unique and, I'm more sort of like passionate about. And so ended up, actually just sort of like finding my way, networking into like a sales oriented role where I spent, kind of like 2 years sort of just cutting my teeth with some of those like, core sales skills and sort of like learning the ropes and like meeting a lot of people down here in Miami and just like building my network. But I always knew I wanted to do something more entrepreneurial. I wanted to, sort of like work with, interesting people and companies. And so then just like by networking like crazy, I started working at a single family office down in Miami that was doing a lot of sort of like early stage private investments, VC style deals. The principal had exited a few, venture backed companies. And so, that was, one of his kind of like core, focus areas and asset classes that he was comfortable with. And so, started full circle on their healthcare team. So looking at like health tech, biotech, med tech deals, something that I was really comfortable with and kind of, spoke that language. Did that for, a year and a half ish, you kind of analyst, associate role there, made a lot of, impact, sort of, in the family office and also like learned a lot about like, what ventures really like, what to look for, sort of pattern recognition, kind of got my feet wet. And then ultimately ended up meeting our founder at Mangusta, Kevin, through a contact at the family office. And, we really hit it off and, kind of saw things, through the same lens in a lot of ways. And, he was like, just kicking things off. He had gotten sort of like his anchor check, but was still like doing some fundraising for family offices. And he was like, hey, why don't you like help me out on the side a bit while you're still at the family office? I could use the support, blah, blah, blah. And then, the rest is sort of history. Kind of started working for him, created a lot of value, I think, at least he would say in the beginning. And then eventually he was like, come join me sort of full time, as my right hand person, on the investment team. And that's where I am today.
And it's really tough because, you had a very unlinear journey where there's tons of sunk costs, right? You spent tons of years just pursuing the doctor career. And you're like, okay, now I guess I'm just going to have to give up all of that because I made my mind that I want to do something else. And, VC is saying it might not be for everyone. So who is VC not for?
Yeah, not for, I would say, if you're not like an entrepreneurial or maybe even like, extroverted, highly extroverted person, I think, it could be a potentially tough industry. And a lot of it is, about access to deals and sort of, building networks, with founders, obviously, but with other VCs, and sort of being able to like attend events and, make yourself, known in some of the communities and public facing in a lot of ways. And, a lot of sort of interpersonal, interactions, whether it's just like on Zoom calls all day for, founder sort of like meetings, or, pitching to like your IC committee. Like a lot of it, takes, energy to sort of like put yourself out there and interact with people. And so if you prefer more, maybe like a lab setting, like a doctor, or, you want to kind of just like, be at your computer, get your work done, type of role, then, VC, could be challenging, or, kind of, tiring for some people.
Yeah, and can you talk about maybe one or two stories of people who hired, maybe even VC interns, scouts? What are two things that they did that made you proud?
Yeah, I mean, I really like to see. I'm all about sort of like proving value in the beginning. So, we have a lot of people obviously reach out, and they're amazing people on paper, and they go to great schools, and they say, hey, like, I interested in Mangusta, interested in venture, can I be an intern? And I usually started off as like, hey, like, I'm happy to have you, do some work for us. We usually start people out on sort of like a trial period. And, if you're really good or ambitious, and, you can help us out in one area, then, we're happy to kind of like consider you as like a full-time intern type of thing. And so I usually ask people sort of like, what do you like about venture? What are you interested in? Do you want to do some of the work on the fundraising side and, reach out to like potential LPs and family offices, or fund to funds? Like, do you like that part of it? Or do you want to do some deal sourcing? Are you interested in like learning how to source deals? Or do you want to help out with like the diligence part? All these different things, sort of combine themselves into what venture is. And so I ask them, what do you like? What are you good at? And they tell me, and then I sort of like give them kind of like a project to start, hey, do this, let's just say it's deal sourcing, do like a market map on an industry that you're passionate about, or, a lot about, find me, some companies you think Mangusta should have looked at that maybe just raised some rounds, and then find me some companies that are probably preparing to like raise their next round that, we should be tracking, or we should be, cold outreaching to, or getting a warm referral to, that, that we should be speaking to these founders. And so the people that do that really well, and like take initiative, and, really come back with something, helpful and thoughtful, those are the people that, stand out to me. And I think, they have the sort of like drive and ambition to do really well in our setting, because we are sort of like an emerging manager, smaller firm. So we need people that are, hungry, and sort of like,
Yeah, and that might sound simple, right? But if you think about it, in every single team, there are some stuff that they might lack or they might need help with a lot more. And if you can kind of just slot yourself in, saying like, hey, I have this unique skill, I have this unique POV, then you can literally become a part of the team. And that's what giving value first is, right? So in terms of, yourself, right? What is your superpower? Is it the sourcing? Is it the founders choosing you because of port help? Or is it fundraising if you only had to choose one?
I would say I kind of pride myself on wearing multiple hats within the firm, and I think our founder Kevin would as well too, because we're such a lean team and we're new. You're almost a startup in and of itself, as sort of like a fund one. So
You
you have
are.
to like be able to like take a founder call, and then 10 minutes later, speak to an LP on why they should trust you and take this journey with you, to be a part of the fund. I would say I think I'm fairly good at networking, and have built a really great network, especially like here in Miami, and now sort of like doing that more in the Bay as I spend more and more time out in San Francisco area. So I think that that's something I'm really good at, and sort of, nurturing those relationships. And I like people. I think people are interesting. I like to learn about them. I try to keep tabs with a lot of people, which is not an easy thing to do, but I think I do it pretty well. And I think people, generally pretty appreciate that. So I think that's something I'm good at, but generally I think the overall kind of like all encompassing thing is, I think, I have a good drive. I generally want to be involved in some of the best deals with the best people and the best companies. And I'll sort of like be pretty relentless on, getting either like introductions to them, or, warm referrals, or just like finding a way to, participate in some of these like great people. And that's what you really have to have, especially as an emerging manager, to be able to like get access to like these really like cream of the crop deals. And I think we've done that really well. So I would say that's probably my superpower.
Yeah, and it seems like you really know how to hustle and really just like build genuine, solid connections with people, right? So for aspiring VCs kind of listening to this, let's talk about how you actually start to build relationships. Let's say you're an aspiring VC, you are going to like the events like you suggested, right? Like how on earth would they even start? Would they just walk up to a VC partner and be like, "Hey, what's up, Natali?" Like, and then start talking? Like, what would that 3 minutes or maybe even 2 minutes actually look like?
There's sort of like two different ends to it. So like one is sort of like, if you're actually attending these events, I think it's a bit easier. Like you get to see people face to face. At generally some point in these events, like, there's someone that's like itching to sort of talk to a person, and you just have to be that person. Like, you know, so, go up to people, like, tell them, hey, I'm, XYZ, and I'm doing this, or I looked at this. It's really cool. Like, what do you do? Like, are you, founder, or are you a VC? And sort of just like get to know people. And I really believe in sort of like the ripple effect. You meet one person, they introduce you to another, they introduce you to another, and so on and so forth. And you really can just like build your network out exponentially from there. On the flip side of that, I think you should be like fairly proactive if you're trying to like break into VC on like reaching out to people that, maybe share some of the same interests, or, VCs that are particularly sort of attractive to you, and just say, hey, like, you're going to get a lot of people won't respond, or you might get rejected a few times, but like keep sending messages, like invite people to coffee chats. And then same thing, just sort of like show them your authentic kind of like unique self, what you're good at, and how you can be like valuable. And people generally, I think, appreciate that. And eventually you'll sort of, break through, or get a chance to do some work for some people.
Yeah, and I'm curious, do you usually get like the phone numbers of people like right during and after events?
Yeah, I really try to. I try to, it's easy now. You just sort of like bump your phones together half the time, and, you get people's contact. So yeah, I try to be diligent with that. After I'm speaking to someone, exchange contact information. I try to text them, generally like the same day, maybe like immediately actually, with, hey, Natoli from Mangusta. Maybe some context like about the conversation, if say like, oh, I enjoyed like chatting with you about this, just so like they remember who I am, because people meet a lot of people at these events, and just in general. So I try to like do it pretty instantaneously, because I think if you wait, then you like forget, or people forget about you. So I try to message people right after I speak to them.
Yeah, and I say the general rule is around within 10 minutes. And that's like the perfect golden time zone where they're like, okay, yeah, we actually remember you. And they would just like keep you on top of mind right after. So in terms of, let's say you built this starting relationship, right? And then you guys are chatting, you guys are, okay, you guys are texting and you're like, hey, let's meet, right? Let's go for a meeting. So when an aspiring VC goes on a meeting, what should they ask a VC?
I would come into it sort of understanding a bit about that VC, doing some homework, doing some research, I guess, to put it like if someone was coming to me sort of like at Mangusta, I'd expect them to maybe like look at some of our portfolio companies, or, understand the background of like Kevin or our other, co-founders, and sort of like have pointed questions around that. And then, once you sort of like talk through it, I think the conversation kind of goes organically. And then, bring up, the things that, you have questions about, like get advice, and, say, hey, on this topic, I actually looked at this deal, or I've been sourcing, for this fund, doing this, or, and be transparent, like, say, hey, I'm looking to, be a scout, or, help be an intern. If the conversation's going well, like, be upfront about it. And generally, even like, if say Mangusta, we have, a few interns at the moment, we don't need another one, I can keep people in mind, like, send me a text in 6 months, because at that point, maybe we do need another intern. Or just ask me like, hey, do you know any other VCs that are like looking for interns, or, could use some help, scouting. And generally, I speak to a lot of people. People are always looking for, hungry, young individuals to help and source deals. And if you're actually good at that, I'm happy to, like make a recommendation for someone else too. So I think, come in prepared, and then, be upfront, with like questions, and also like transparent on like what you want to get out of it, and how they might be able to help you. And I think more often than not, people are generally, good about, doing other people right. And especially like young people who are trying to either break into the industry, or, or sort of like early career, at least from my experience, because I know a lot of people, kind of helped me along the way as well.
Yeah. And, even though they might be older than you, they are people as well. So treat them like normal people, treat them like friends, and just have a cool, chill meeting. And let's say you have this amazing meeting, right? How on earth does an aspiring VC just really maintain that relationship with the VC?
I think it's just those touch points. Like send me an email with like a cool deal saying like, "Hey, I thought of you and like Mangusta and, did you guys take a look at this?" Or send me, I usually give people like my WhatsApp or text, like send me a cool sort of like breaking news, VC, raise that you saw on, traded VC or Twitter or X, I guess. Whatever, sort of you think, might be interesting or loop it into like the conversation that we had. Be sort of, personal about it. Also, you're probably attending, if someone, I guess, maybe is closer to your age or something, you're probably attending, events. And so like invite them like, oh, or ask them, are you going to this event? Are you going to this demo day? Are you going to this pitch contest? Whatever it may be, and try to, meet up with them again in person or, um, schedule like a follow-up sort of coffee in 6 months to talk about sort of like the latest and whatever it may be, but be persistent with people and be genuine and have multiple touch points because otherwise people will inevitably forget about you if you speak to them once and then never message them or talk to them again. So getting people to like remember you and remind things that remind you of them.
Yeah, staying on top of mind. So I know you keep on mentioning events because that's how you've really networked. And it's a really, really good way to just like stay on top of mind because you see each other like all the time in events, especially if you live near the same area, right? And you're in the same startup ecosystem. So how does going to events actually look like? Like what events should an aspiring VC actually go to? Is it only the pitch events because that's a lot more effective? Or what else should they do? Like, how did they even get to start on this?
For some people, that might be, sort of like a happy hour kind of like, founder, small circle type thing, or a dinner or something like that, where you can, maybe speak to like one or two people in more depth. Or for other people, it could be, these large sort of like pitch contests or like a demo day where you're really, having like a lot of kind of like quick conversations and like meeting a bunch of people and then can follow up with them afterwards. Or maybe it's sort of like all of the above. But I think, find out what you like and make sure that you actually like attend those. I think it can be like exhausting, or if you feel like, you attended an event and you didn't get anything out of it, like, oh, like, well, I don't want to attend the next event because, the one that I just did last week was no good. But, there's plenty of like events where you're going to meet really great people. So find the ones that you like, that you enjoy, that you find interesting. And I feel like you'll get a lot more out of them by attending those rather than just maybe attending like every single event that you see on Luma.
How about for yourself? Like, what did those, I guess, like first couple events actually look like? Because you were, you basically were a researcher, and then you went on to do kind of recruiting people. So, um, what events like did you start with? Was it just like the happy hours, or what did it look like for you that you liked?
So I think I started more with
Okay.
kind of like one-on-ones or, really tapping into like my existing networks. Like had friends that were in the space or maybe that were, alumni that were older that I could, confidently and comfortably sort of like reach out to. And then really kind of, what I said, being like direct, like, hey, I did this in the past. I'm doing this now. I have this background. I have this skill set. Like, who do you think I should talk to? Or, what do you recommend that I should do? And, they usually will tell you like, oh, I actually have this friend. He, does this. You should speak to him because he like is really into healthcare and like he's been, doing angel investing and like scouting part-time for a fund. So maybe ask him like about his fund or something. And then you talk to another person and then eventually you speak to the right person and you, get a chance to like, I was working as like sort of like an intern at first for the family office. And then, quickly he was like, oh, like, we need more help, come on full-time analyst, sort of working with, the directors for the family office, just then once you're in, then it's kind of like off to the races. You really learn a lot really fast. You're exposed to a lot. And you build those skill sets and, then you're, more marketable and, more helpful to firms and can kind of go from there. But I started more sort of like on the one-on-ones and really just sort of tapping into like my existing network. And then obviously once I was sort of like doing that, I was then starting to attend, the more public forum, larger event scales and just, again, sort of like meeting with people, getting their numbers, trying to schedule them for like one-on-ones maybe after the event. if I thought they could be, super valuable or someone that I just liked in general. So taking it, I think progressing it from, like maybe a big event to like one-on-ones or, if you can tap into some things earlier, I always think, more personal settings are good because you can really get to know each other.
Yeah, and especially for students, right? It's you can go to those hackathons, you can go to those like private student pitch events, and if you just go there, right, you're gonna meet the judges. It could be professors, it could be like entrepreneurs, it could be VCs, right? And you can just like start from there. You start from maybe a smaller type of thing, and then you go a little more public, you go bigger to go to even bigger events, and you just build up from there. And after that, if you're actually networking like Natali did, and you're definitely going to get invites to even more private events, which is even better. So, I'm curious, like when you mentioned like the family office also does like the early stage investments, right? How is it different from like right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the major difference is sort of like the structure itself. So obviously, like the family office is, one person sort of like capital, and he's thought about how he wants to allocate, a portion of that capital to the venture asset class, but he's also investing in other asset classes as well, like real estate or public equities or private credit, whatever it may be. I don't know. I was focused on like the venture side of things there, but obviously he's doing much more than that. So kind of have to think about in the constraint of sort of how much what the check sizes sort of look like for him, and how much of like his net worth, I guess, he wants to put into the venture asset class. And then generally, I think family offices have. I mean, I think VC funds as well too have some sort of like taste or thesis, but a lot of times, I think family offices, it's either, what they're kind of like comfortable with. Like if the principal made their money in healthcare, for example, they might be more, they have a more affinity to like healthcare companies. And so you're really not going to go out of the box as much, or maybe have so much sort of like freedom to look at other, early stage startups. Like they really want to invest in healthcare because that's what they know. That's what they're passionate about. They want to make an impact there. So it could be more kind of like impact investing in a way, I think, or something that they think is, just like kind of cool at the end of the day. Oh, like I see this, in the future being a big thing. I want to have a play in it and whatnot. Also, I think at the end of the day, ultimately at the family office, like the decision on whether to invest or not comes down to sort of like one person, so he's kind of like the sole decision maker, where, at Mangusta or other funds, you have more of like a committee and it's more of like a roundtable kind of like discussion, where at the family office, it's more, hey, we looked into this company, we did this work, here's what we found, yes or no kind of thing. So it's just like a little bit different setup. But generally, I think, how you go about sort of like finding companies and meeting, with founders is the same. I think we're unique at Mangusta in that we have, a pretty great sort of like anchor LP in the Luxottica family office. So like the founders behind like Ray-Ban, Oakley, on large sort of like consumer conglomerates globally. So we're able to actually like tap into their network and do a lot of like portfolio advisory type work. Where at the family office, I think you're more kind of just like a smaller, not angel check, but smaller capital, check. Where at Mangusta, we can really do a lot of stuff on like the support and ecosystem side of things as well too. So at the family office, you weren't really doing much of that. Maybe an intro here or there, but it was more just like providing some capital to these founders, early on.
Yeah, and definitely a lot less structured in the way where you can actually kind of think of it as more of an angel investment versus like a VC investment. And that's why, like family offices, they invest their money into VCs. So the VCs who sees like thousands and do thousands of deals every single year can actually make a better decision. So I know you mentioned that you started in that family office, right? On the venture side as an intern. So in terms of, I guess, like what made the director or the guy choose you rather than anyone else? Because you started with more of a non-linear background. Was it because that you did a bit of healthcare? Is that the reason why you were chosen?
I got a warm referral from someone in my network that said, hey, basically like I don't think I would have gotten an interview probably, on paper necessarily if it wasn't for that warm referral. So the person was like, "Oh, hey, I actually know Natoli and like, he's great and you should at least meet with him." And I think, at the time the family office was sort of like debating, do we want someone who maybe has a little bit more, technical sort of speak the language on the healthcare, sort of like biotech, med tech side, or do we want someone who maybe is more traditional sort of like finance background. And ultimately they were like, let's do both. Let's bring on two interns. And so they picked one sort of like more sciencey person, which was myself, and then one, more sort of like finance person, which was, another individual. And then, we both started, sort of like working. And I think, they went a different path, and I think ended up going into like banking or something afterwards. And they were like, well, we would love to kind of like bring you on in a more full time capacity. You've done great work, and you really built up all the sort of like hard skills on like the returns and analysis for these companies. And you already have the science background, and we think you could be really valuable to the team. And then obviously sort of like got along really well with everyone, and really just like was kind of like checking like, hey, am I doing this right, or like am I doing a good job on this, trying to put the best foot forward, and like running at different projects that maybe like weren't directly assigned to me but I thought I could help out with. So really just like trying to do as much as I could, and I think they appreciated that, and it ended up turning into from evolving from like an intern to full-time position.
You mentioned always asking for feedback. What does that actually look like?
Generally I try to talk to either, sort of like my boss or, a mentor or someone, and ask them like, hey, I did this. I thought about it this way. What would you have done? Or, how would you have done this differently in the future? Do you think I could, look at it from a different way? Or do you think I could, do this differently? And sort of like understanding their taste and how they like things done, so that you can like create really good work product, in one iteration, rather than have to like, well, I actually do the things this way, and then having to do like a bunch of revisions. Obviously, there's going to be some of that regardless. But really putting together like, really good materials, or, under not wasting their time by like, oh, I like this founder, but understanding like it's not really within like the thesis, or, what they like to see from founders, some of those qualities. So understanding what they like, and then, helping you, that'll help you sort of decide, what you like as well too. But sort of matching it up with them, and making sure that you're kind of, being super helpful, from the first conversation or like the first piece of work that you do. And then, any feedback that they do give you, like make sure you write it down, or like take it to heart, and like actually do those things. Cause I think that's probably frustrating for the person if they tell you something, and then the next time you do something, it's, like they didn't tell you at all. So, make sure that you actually like, apply it.
And what did the looking into opportunities that actually is effective, right? Because you want to do extra stuff that is within the mission, within the thesis, instead of just like doing some random ass stuff, right? So do you have to actively ask, like, hey, I saw this thing that I can do as an extra side task. Do you think it is part of the main mission? Do you have to ask that, or do you just like go ahead and do it and then say like, hey, I've done it. Here's my work. Could you check it?
Yeah, I think probably depends on sort of like who you're working with and the place. Because I do think it's a fine line. Like focus is really important. In general, I think with like everything, even outside of venture, like you need to be able to like focus on something, or like if you have a task, like you need to be able to like take that from start to finish, and do a really good job on that. But at the same time, like you should always be looking to like expand into other areas and like learn new skill sets. And so, generally, some things, if I maybe they were sort of like lower on the totem pole, I could kind of just like run at them, or be like, hey, like I actually looked into this. This was cool. I saw this, blah, blah, blah. But if it was more of like a big sort of like undertaking or project, then yeah, of course you should probably, talk to the person like, hey, I'm going to get this done. I know we're focused on this, but I actually thought this was really interesting. Like, do you think it's worth me spending some time about it, and get their opinion? Because sometimes maybe you are like, especially like young, hungry people, like you're ambitious and you want to kind of like run at a lot. But, it's good to like get advice from, your boss or manager or coworker or colleague, to kind of like maybe tell you, hey, like I actually don't think that's worth, as much of your time, because your time's valuable. So like, let's focus on this, and maybe like we can revisit that, or like, let's rework that. Because, sometimes you can be like a little sporadic and just like throw yourself at a lot, and then, everything is kind of mediocre. So you need people to like rein you in a bit too, if you're like, really like a driven kind of like, ambitious person.
Yeah. And, sometimes that's why even within workplaces or even outside of it, you should have mentors. And in terms of like VC, right? Like, what does the different roles look like? The junior roles, the senior roles, what on earth are the roles in a VC fund?
Yeah. I mean, I think it varies a little bit from fund to fund. I think we're, quite unique in the fact that, we're, an emerging manager. So everyone kind of has to do a little bit of everything. But generally, I think, some of like the core skills that I think about, going from like analyst to associate, blah, blah, blah. So I think analysts really help with kind of like, market mapping, ecosystem research, like tracking trends, identifying like white space opportunities, like becoming knowledgeable themselves on sort of like emerging themes and, presenting those. And then also helping with like the diligence support. So kind of like some of the nitty gritty stuff from like, supporting deal flow evaluation to modeling or benchmarking, competitor reviews, all these things. And then, actually kind of like putting the materials together a bit. So like the memo writing, and then the fun part of the analyst is like you're really just kind of like building your network for the first time. So, early founder and like venture relationship building. So like engaging with founders, accelerators, other investors, like building your own sort of like unique network. And then, some of the like, making sure that you are really detail oriented, like that you're learning things, that you're curious. I think all of those kind of like go into being an analyst. And then, as you sort of like progress farther and farther down, you become more of sort of like taking real ownership, like, oh, this is a deal that I'm leading and like I'm managing it. And, I have to, coordinate with the founder, or I have to negotiate sort of like term sheets, or, I have to support this, portfolio support of like a founder that I invested in, and helping them with like intros or like tactical sort of like projects, or helping them with like their fundraising, or whatever it may be. And then ultimately, I think, and I'm not there yet, is like if you're like a partner or, a GP, where you really have to like have the ownership over like all the relationships for the fund. So like driving like LP, trust, and like securing commitments into the fund, and, actually like setting the fund vision and thesis and strategy like yourself, and, what makes you different, and sort of like crafting that. Hiring as well, I think, is something, important for, for these more senior sort of like GP level people, like building the right team around you, and, promoting people. And, that's something you don't really think about sort of like as an analyst, but all kind of goes into it. And just being like the public sort of like face of the firm, and the identity of it. And yeah, so I think, that's sort of some of the progression, but, each role you kind of like, refine those skills more and more, and take more and more ownership as you sort of move up the ladder.
And you definitely took a lot more ownership because last time I seen you, you were a principal and now you're an investment partner. So talk a little about, when you first started at Mangusta to right now and your promotion journey. Like how on earth did it happen? Like specifically go on like some specific as how you got promoted.
When I first joined, like I said, I was actually working I was still working at the family office and helping on like a more project sort of basis, particularly deal sourcing, and like also with fundraising, and sort of like tapping into some of my Miami network, which, I think was helpful. And so, was doing that. And then ultimately the first kind of, promotion, I guess, would be, join me full time. You know, I want to take you from, being an analyst to kind of like the first, full-time hire at Mangusta, like outside of the partners and the co-founders. And so, that was awesome. And, sort of like learning a lot and sitting in on every call, and sort of figuring out where I wanted to fit in, and all these different things. And then, we're a very lean team. So I think, titles are, not as corporate or sort of like institutional, where if you were at like a big VC fund, it's like, 2 years, you get promoted to associate, and then 2 years, VP or whatever it may be. So I think Kevin was like, you're doing a lot of the work of, what a principal or sort of like junior partner would be doing. Like you're engaging with LPs, and you're leading, sourcing from start to finish, and presenting them to IC, and, working on materials. And so really had my hands in a lot of different areas, and was being impactful. And so he was like, I think, ultimately like, principal or like junior partner, which is sort of like my current title, is sort of the right fit. But ultimately, like, I still see myself as, someone, who is younger and like has a lot to learn. So I don't like, think I'm not, kind of like at the GP level or anything close to that. I'm still sort of like at this sort of associate level, principal. I am leading a lot more stuff than I think maybe, an associate at like a big firm. But I'm still like developing like a lot of these skill sets still, and still have a lot to learn, and take a lot away from Kevin and the other co-founders, every single day. So, definitely not sort of like, blind to that it all can't happen like immediately. I'm still, maturing and sort of like growing, and, learning a lot of new skills every single day.
Yeah. And I'm sure Kevin will say the same, where it's like if a VC stops learning, that's when they stop growing, and that's when they stop to become an effective VC. So could you talk a little bit about your maybe partners and what you are kind of learning from each other?
Yeah, so I think I guess I'll start with Kevin, and I should say like our team is fairly lean. So Kevin, and then he has two co-founders, and then there's two sort of like principals, junior partners, self and Lewis, and then we have like an associate, and then a few interns as well. So it's not like a huge team, especially on the sort of like full time day to day stuff. Kevin, obviously I work super closely with. And yeah, I learn stuff from him every day. I mean, so I guess for a little bit of history on his background. So like the last decade of his career was spent at SoftBank. He was one of the founding members of their Vision Fund, working directly with Masa, investing in a lot of sort of like generational companies, and working, through a wide variety of industries as well too. So he has a lot of industry specific knowledge that I kind of learn from every single day. So a lot of times we might be meeting with like a niche sort of company in a specific industry because we're, very verticalized in sort of like AI application layer, type investing. And so, I have to like really do my homework and learn about an industry, but he has, some really particular insights from like a previous company he maybe invested in at SoftBank, that was in a similar sort of space, and so can kind of learn ins and outs of industries from him. And then also I think on the relationship building side too, SoftBank again was this, I think at one point it was the largest venture fund in the world, so they had I think close to like over 100 investors, let's say. I think it was closer to like 200, which is pretty crazy to think about. And then at some point they also had like 20 investors, and so like a lot of these people who were with the firm at one point either went and joined like a growth equity fund or started their own venture fund or went and worked for a startup. So he has this really vast network that's valuable for us to tap into, but also just sort of like him plugging me in to these people, having me meet them, and then sort of like ripple effect, and then sort of like what to do from there, and how to like actually be beneficial to some of these people. So teaching me, I guess, sort of the lay of the land on how we can help, founders and VCs and share deal flow, and setting it up like kind of like quarterly calls with VCs that we really respect to sort of like exchange some deal flow and talk about deals that we think might be interesting, and sort of just like the best practices to go about that. So I would say that, and then from the other co-founders, they're more sort of like entrepreneurial, they're really successful entrepreneurs and angel investors. So learning, I guess, maybe more the day to day on like how a business should run, and specifically again the industries that they have like extreme expertise in, um and some of the things to look out for there, and thinking sort of like a founder, because they are founders themselves, and I think that's a really important and also like helpful outlook for someone like myself, who's always been entrepreneurial but never had a company of my own, where they've actually had companies run them, have done a ton of hiring, and they can sort of like think about some of the little things or little areas that maybe I wasn't exposed to from being an operator, because that's also super valuable. um yeah, so I think those, and then Lewis, who's the other sort of like junior partner principal. He actually handles a lot of our sort of like European and Korea, Asia deal flow, because we do have some presence in Asia, and so understanding sort of like the, I guess, macroeconomics and different and government things in sort of like Asia, Korea, for example. Like a lot of the companies, when they get to a certain scale, the government actually like invests them, or so like puts money into like helping them grow. So understanding, I guess, just like how the ins and outs sort of like work for that. It's a bit different than in the US. So learning, a lot of things about, so I guess, global, investing rather than, just sort of like US focused, or, even smaller in our sort of like Silicon Valley, Miami, New York, bubbles that, I tend to be in a lot.
Yeah, and you're basically getting the best of all four sides. What excellence actually looks like for investing, for angel investing, for the operation side as an entrepreneur, and also, international investing, what actually looks like. So this is really, really amazing and really crucial, especially for someone who's growing. I bet you're growing like exponentially because of that. So you must be like pretty busy, right? As someone on the investment side of things, what does your typical day look like? Just choose one day from your calendar and then tell me what the 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. down is.
Yeah. So usually in the mornings, I kind of have like a call with Kevin to sort of like talk about, strategy and sort of, priorities for the day. So, having that sort of like structure, kind of like daily, type meeting, or at least, semi daily. I'm in the mornings. And then, it's meeting with a lot of founders. So I would say, it's probably, two or three founder, sort of like Zoom calls, and, then sort of like initial sort of like thoughts. And I guess, thinking about those companies and people, more deeply, maybe looking through their materials, looking through like a lot of pitch decks that either get sent to us, or, of companies that I've met with who have shared their materials. So a lot of that. And then, probably some actual, kind of like not busy work, but like, in the weeds, like putting together materials, or, working on, a memo or like a research report, or sort of like understanding something, that either, we want to think more deeply about, or, that we might be like presenting to IC or whatever it may be, but actually, some of that, like you have to sit down at your computer and do that. And then probably like attending like an event at night, or, getting a drink with, a VC, or, something in person. And then a lot of those also are virtual too, but like staying in touch with, other sort of like VCs in the area. And then, like I said, one thing that I do, and I think is, I don't know if it's unique, but I enjoy, is I have these kind of recurring sort of like quarterly calls with like 4 or 5 people that really respect, and they have a lot of overlap with our fund. And, can sort of like have a call with them, every few months, to talk about some of the interesting deals that they've worked on or they've seen, and ask questions about them, and telling them, oh, you should look at this, what do you think about this, and sort of like getting, thoughts. So that's what the day to day looks like. And then when I go to the Bay Area, which is sort of like once a month, I would say it's like a lot more kind of like in person, because there's just like so many events there, and kind of just like, going to a bit of everything, when I'm there for that sort of like 1 week a month. But yeah, it's really kind of like generalist, all encompassing, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But, a lot of founder meetings, a lot of pitch decks, and a lot of just like meeting people, and getting to know them.
I'm curious, for the recurring meetings, are those usually personas of VCs, founders? What are they?
Yeah, VCs, kind of like sort of, like trading deal flow in some way, or just like, talking about interesting deals that we've seen, asking them if they've looked at them. And then, in the interim, we sort of like passively float, cool opportunities to one another, because everyone's network is a bit different, and, you want to have access to these, and sort of like tap into, to know other people's networks. And, so we're just trying to see as many deals as possible, and, really then narrow it down to, picking the best people and companies that we want to work with. And so, people that we respect and have a lot of overlap with, it's really beneficial to like, get their thoughts, or to look at some of the deals that have come on their plate, and see if it's interesting on our end.
Yeah. Let's talk about the deals. For a VC looking at deals every single day, what are your top three things that you look for in a startup when you're considering whether or not to invest?
Yeah, so I would say we look at everything pretty holistically. So we always like to say sort of like the 4 M's. Kevin really likes acronyms, so we've kind of like coined it like that. But the first one would be sort of like the market. So, understanding sort of like the size of the market, and, how fast it's growing, and what do adjacent markets look like that it can potentially break into? What are the competitors, that are already in the market? We really probably want to meet with most, if not all, of the companies that are in this space, to decide, which one we really want to back. Um, sort of like how they're differentiated, within the market. I guess any sort of like macro issues like in the market, or, things that might be good, like tailwinds. So just really understanding the market, sort of like from all angles. The second would be model. So, typically we're investing in like vertical AI application, software companies. So, generally we like, sort of like recurring revenue models, and, we have certain benchmarks that, are usually hit for software businesses around like gross margins, and, other sort of like more, financial aspects that we want to look at. And then the third would be the management. So like the team itself. So obviously that is incredibly important. We want to back the best people, and, we like to, see repeat founders, and we like to see teams that sort of like complement each other really well, whether it's, a CEO who can like tell the story really well, and, sell the product, and be sort of like, the face, and then like a CTO who's very technical and can like build an incredible product and ship new features really fast. We like to see teams that kind of like complement each other really well. And then yeah, so yeah, and I'd say like that's probably the most important that we look at. So market, model, management, and I'm blanking. And then I guess the money. So like, what are the actual terms of the deal? So who are the co-investors? We generally like to, participate alongside other, kind of like really reputable VCs, either that's a tier one or tier two, or I'm like a really strong angel. So, some of that institutional kind of like validation, we're generally either co-leading or following on deals. So we're usually not leading solo. So we want to see like a strong investor syndicate or, previous investors who are, alongside us. So that's important to us as well. So those four items I would say are what we look at. The most important, I think for me, would be the management team. So I'd say like that's number one. So I'm always, under the impression like the people are, the crux of the business. And if you have really good people, they'll find a way to succeed and overcome hurdles and obstacles. And then the market, understanding sort of like has to be a large market, or the ability to like expand into other markets to kind of like capture more market share. And then the other thing that we are interested in, I guess, is this co-investment syndicate. So that's important to us to participate alongside a lot of other like really great VCs and people and trusted people in our network. So I would say those three items are really standouts.
Yeah, and in terms of co-investing with syndicates, what does that actually look like in terms of VC funds, right? That's just, you just write a check, you get a bunch of people together. Syndicates are LPs come together just for that deal, right? So is there a lot more complications while investing with syndicates?
Yeah, I meant syndicate just as like a general term. So we're not actually, yeah, not like an SPV syndicating our LPs into a specific deal. Yeah, we're, investing from the fund, on behalf of the LPs, just like traditional fund structure. But I meant like our just like co-investors that are also in on the deal. So, if, Founders Fund or Sequoia is leading the round for this seed stage company, that's something that we look at. And, we try to speak to, individuals on their team and understand like the insights and some of the work that they put in to ultimately want to lead this deal. And so that's something that's really important to us is understanding like who our co-investors for the deal itself are. So yeah, that's what I meant by that.
And that's also how you play devil's advocate is you get the POV of other people who maybe even has been in this investing journey a lot longer. And you're like, okay, do they actually believe in it or do they not? So could you maybe even talk about one or two stories of your most successful investments so far? How did you meet the founders and how did you know that they were the one?
Yeah. So I guess I'll start out with one maybe from Kevin's perspective, because I think it kind of touches a little bit on like sort of like, his network and like, a cool kind of, value add and how Mangusta gets access to a lot of, really amazing deals. So the first one, is one of our portfolio companies, and, he had worked with, this founder at SoftBank for his last company. This person, exited his company to Snowflake, and then, was there for a long time, and, really kind of just like, genius, founder, incredibly hungry, ready for his next, sort of, play in the space. And, it was being led by, some really incredible firms like Lightspeed and Kleiner Perkins were co-leading his round for his new startup. And they were going to take up all the allocation as sort of like his seed round. And, Kevin had this previous relationship with him, and, we met with him and learned what was new and how what he wants to do with this next business. And we were, sort of just like from the moment we spoke to him, like, this guy's incredible. Kevin obviously had worked with him in the past. And, he talked us through like the problem and what they're solving, and, really sort of like explained it to us, very simply, and sort of, how they can create real value for customers. And then we were like, well, we have to get in on this deal. And so I think that kind of like plays into like what's interesting about us and, being in this Luxottica ecosystem, like I mentioned, as one of the large sort of like consumer conglomerates globally, we are able to tap into that network because, beyond sort of like the big flashy names like Ray-Ban and Oakley, Luxottica also owns and operates, 40 plus businesses throughout the US and Europe. And they span a wide variety of industries and scales from like small businesses to like enterprise scale. In like logistics, supply chain, fintech, they really have a lot of coverage. And so we're able to introduce our portfolio to these businesses of Luxottica and actually get them like contracted ARR from day one or pilot contracts. And we've been able to successfully do that for, a lot of our portfolio. And so we kind of explained this to our founder, and he was, really impressed by this. And we made an introduction. It actually got them, one of their first sort of like pilot contracts that then eventually turned into like a full-time contract. And so he let us in on sort of the round, and the only people that were able to participate in that round were, Lightspeed, Kleiner, and Mangusta. So that's, a pretty cool story about kind of like our access and like unique value prop. And something like we were really excited about, like from the first conversation. A second one that I recently, and it'll get announced sort of like a PR release in a few weeks, but that I was really excited about, from the onset was, a founder kind of tackling a really interesting problem in sort of like live AI sales space, and, sort of like helping sales teams, be more effective in real time with closing deals. And from the first conversation, like you could feel sort of the urgency and I guess like grinder sort of like mentality, like do anything at all costs to kind of make this work. And, that sort of like, felt that through the screen, even through the first interview or first meeting between us. And then you sort of like start looking, deeper and deeper into the business, and they have incredible traction and, really great enterprise customers that are on like their second or third contracts, and, something that we got excited about, really quickly. And so, we're participating in that one. And, even since, our check, a month ago, and like I said, it's going to get released soon, the company's growing, incredibly fast. And, we're really bullish on the company and the founder. And I think, a lot of our companies, have a similar sort of like sentiment as well. But we really, try to back, amazing people that, have super strong strengths, like strength of strengths, and kind of like take a business from like 0 to 1, and then, from 1 to 100. So, we're really excited about our portfolio, and a lot of the companies are crushing it, which is awesome.
How did you guys find the second founder?
Yeah, it was actually a referral from a VC in my network who was like, "Hey, we're taking a look at this deal, and, one of these sort of like close relationships. We're thinking about participating in the round. Would love for you guys to meet with them and see if it's something that aligns." And it definitely did. So we were really excited about it.
Yeah, and then for the first founder, I know that you mentioned Luxottica. You guys have a relationship where you can even go to the point of, helping your portfolio company secure those pilots, secure those contracts with Luxottica's companies. So how on earth does that actually work? Like in the terms of, building relationships, do you guys like often meet with the director of Luxottica? How on earth do you guys make sure that the interests are aligned so that you can literally just introduce your founders and they would be like, okay, yeah, let's do a contract?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So yeah, obviously, they're our anchor LP, so they have, incentives are aligned. Like if our companies do really well, that's great for them just from like a monetary perspective. But yes, we have like a list actually of like their core sort of companies, and some of the like auxiliary ones as well too, that we can share with our founders, from like a go-to-market perspective. And usually we'll do a little bit more deep diving, like, hey, we think, this company, is most applicable to you. Like it fits really well as like a potential customer for you. And then we have contacts at all of those companies, sort of like either like their CFOs or, like chief strategy officers, like, executive level people at all of these companies that they are looking to actually like use AI tools. So incentives are aligned on their side too, from like the business perspective. Like they want their businesses to become more efficient, and they, like to try out new AI tools, and they understand that we're kind of like a trusted partner for them. And obviously, are ingrained in the Luxottica ecosystem. And so they encourage us to, send these deals, and then they set up conversations with our portfolio, founders. And then obviously, from there, it's up to the portfolio founder. We can sort of get you to the gate, but to like close the deal, that's up to them. And understanding that if it makes sense for, the Luxottica, companies. But we have, these really high level sort of like executive, people that we've built really good relationships with. We have, some recurring meetings with them to talk about like their priorities and, what AI tools, could be most helpful in their businesses. So we try to understand, what each business is sort of looking for. And then we can kind of, send our portfolio off to meet with them and build relationships on their own, and hopefully, turn them into customers. And we've been able to do that successfully for, multiple different companies. So it's really great.
And what did those reoccurring meetings actually look like? Is it quarterly? Is it yearly? Is it in person? Is it like virtual? What does it actually?
Yeah, it's been mostly virtual, but, some of them, I guess, when we go, we have an office in Milan, because the family office is sort of based in Milan, and one of our co-founder lives there. And so, when we go out there, some of their companies are based in sort of like the, European ecosystem. And so that would be a good touch point for us to like meet those people face to face, where most of the time it would be virtual with them. But yeah, mostly Zoom, but occasionally sort of in person. And then yeah, just sort of like general catch ups, talking about sort of like the business, sort of like the latest on their end. Again, what, would be most useful to them, maybe what they've tried recently, what they liked, what they didn't like, understanding their sort of like taste for, some of these AI softwares and AI tools. And yeah, on the like a time perspective, I would say, yeah, probably around quarterly. But sometimes they'll ping us, before and say, hey, we have a question about, this AI tool that, maybe like the finance department was trying out. Like, can you guys look at it? So, we also help them from that standpoint as well too. Where they can like ask us questions, and we're happy to like look into things for them if they think it's beneficial.
Yeah, and they see and they share their trends, and I want to hear about your trends, right? What is being overlooked in the market right now?
Yeah, yeah, I think, one space that I guess I find really interesting, is sort of like the AI, HR and recruiting space. So we've met with a lot of different companies in the space, and I do think it's a process that ultimately, can sort of be automated end to end. And so I think it's a really interesting one. Obviously there's, a few, kind of like players in the space, like, like Juicebox and, like People GPT, but ultimately I think there's some I guess space for someone to maybe do it for like more regulated industries. So for like either like healthcare, or I think healthcare is a good one to help with sort of like hiring in that space, because I think right now a lot of them are like startup centric, so they're like hiring for startups because startups do a lot of hiring. So like a series B startup, and they want to do it quick, and they can be use an AI tool, and maybe it's more price sensitive because the startups they don't have like ungodly amounts of cash, a lot of them. So they, instead of hiring like a traditional sort of like recruiting service, they can do it much cheaper with like an AI tool, and, maybe it's more effective too. But I think, this could also be applied to like some of these like large legacy industries that are looking for like very specific people that have like a very specific skill set that may be hard, for like a traditional sort of like recruiting hiring agency to do, that AI might be able to like really skill map these people and kind of like find them more appropriately and more accurately more often, and help hiring in sort of like these large kind of like legacy regulated institutions. And so I think that's a cool sort of space in general, but also expanding it to more kind of like legacy industries rather than just like sort of startup focused. But a lot of them I think are starting with sort of at the place that's sort of most comfortable with them. And obviously, startups are doing a lot of hiring. Like I said, it's a good place. It's kind of like an entry point.
Yeah, and you're definitely one of the experts in this area. So I know you're going to find an amazing company in that area. How about on the venture capital side? What trends are you excited about?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit out of scope for us because obviously, like, we're an early stage fund. But I find some of the sort of like growth stage sort of rounds, interesting and, sort of like exciting just to kind of like track them. The raising these, Anthropic just raised, $10 billion at a $350 billion valuation. And, I think 6 months ago they were at like $180 billion valuation. So, essentially like a 2x in sort of like 6 months. So I think, sort of like tracking these companies and, understanding, sort of like where the maybe like ceiling is for them, if they have any, is sort of just like an interesting space, and, following those trends and kind of like those big companies and sort of how they're differentiating themselves. I think Anthropic's really pulled away from like a coding perspective, and OpenAI is obviously trying to like, handle more like the consumer, kind of like day to day, questioning and search. So yeah, I think that stuff is quite interesting. On the early stage VC side, I guess, from like a fundraising standpoint, like, it's also interesting to see like Andreessen just raised, a huge, I think like $15 billion fund, and how that kind of like impacts, smaller kind of like emerging managers who I guess are like more performance driven rather than just sort of like AUM driven. And I ultimately, think it's sort of like a good thing for, managers like us, who operate in this sort of like 80 to 250 $300 million kind of range, because we're really aligned on sort of like the incentives, like performance over everything, rather than just like collecting as much AUMs and sort of like writing checks into every sort of a company that you find. I think it's hard to really have as much quality at their scale compared to like what we're doing at Mangusta. And so I think it's interesting to see how venture is sort of like changing from like there's just a lot more money into like these premier sort of like big firms.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good metric to track because, VCs, they have to know about secondaries as well. So then when their founders go and raise that Series A, Series B, C, D, right? You can actually help and introduce to the right VCs that maybe has made those really, really big bets so far. So in terms of before, right, you were talking about the recruiting aspect. Could you talk just a little bit about like, because I know you hired maybe an associate, right? What did the interview rounds actually look like? Was it just like, hey, warm intro and then maybe one round of like getting know to every single team and then that's it? Or was there cases and etc.?
Yeah, really, like I mentioned a little bit before, we like to sort of like see some work product and sort of start people out on kind of like a project sort of basis. So like to see the work that they kind of produce. But yeah, for like the associate, it was sort of a warm referral who, was interested in Mangusta and in the space. I sort of had the initial kind of like intro conversation. Spoke to him, sort of like got a good feel for, him as a person, and ultimately, liked him. And so then he met with Kevin, and then, Kevin and I and the person sort of like brainstormed on where he thought he might be, most valuable, and where he kind of wanted to learn, things at first. Kind of threw him into the fire for that, and he came out, doing a really good job. And then ultimately we were like, we could use some more help in these areas. So let's bring him on to help, permanently. So yeah, it was a pretty simple process. It was kind of, in meeting me, meeting Kevin, and then just like showing us that you can do really good work and that you're sort of like smart and can, learn things and ask questions. And, he was able to do all of that, which is awesome.
Yeah, there you go. I know you talked a little bit about how to break into VC. For our viewers who needs an actionable plan to implement right away, what would be your recommended 6-month theoretical plan to fully break into VC? Maybe even perhaps researchers or, in other industries. And the same month one, two, three, four, five.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, like month 1/2, I would say, is to start thinking sort of like an investor. So, what are your skill sets, or like what are you interested in? For me, obviously it was like healthcare. So understand, or what you're interested in. So like start to look at certain verticals or sectors that you generally genuinely like care about, or have a skill set in or are interested in. And that is going to be dependent sort of like on the person. And then start like looking into companies that, maybe like the top companies that are really good in those areas, like the current ones, and understanding sort of like what they do, why they're winning at the moment. Maybe look at some of the ones that like raised some venture capital money, but like didn't pan out. Like, why did those companies fail? Really becoming sort of like an expert in this niche, and, sort of like thinking about a little bit of everything. And then I would say, maybe write some, like, look into some companies that, you think look interesting, in this space, now that you have this sort of like knowledge set, and like write an investment memo, or like write a blog post, or, write something, but like put your thoughts sort of like on paper. So, because I think that just sort of like helps you understand it more. And, do that a few times until you sort of like feel comfortable sort of doing that. And then I would say, after you've done that, maybe map it up with like a VC firm. So maybe this is like month 2 or 3, that, focuses on like healthcare or like AI infra, whatever, you did your research on, you feel super comfortable with, and come to them, with some of the startups that you looked at, or maybe, did a deep dive on, and say, hey, your thesis is looking for the seed, AI infra companies. I saw these, I looked at, some of the big players in the space, and like, here's the gap on, what this company is solving for. And, send them that, and, see if they, will have a conversation with you about it. And if it doesn't work, do it again, or, send it to someone else, or, source a different startup and do something similar. And I would say, like, be very organized with this as well too. Like, maybe like create some sort of like deal tracker, save it into like a drive that, you can, have everything sort of like ready to go. But then start having these chats, and have more and more of them, and, network. And eventually I think, this is probably like month 4 or 5, you'll probably, have met with, a half a dozen or a dozen sort of like investors. You've shared your memos, you've sourced companies. Now you can, I guess, throughout the whole time maybe, but even more so, you can start attending like founder sort of like heavy events, like meeting more companies. And then eventually, once you get sort of like close to someone, or, you've shared a few deals that they really like, or you get really positive feedback, ask them for an internship, or ask them for like a full-time sort of like scouting role. I think scouting is probably like one of the best ways to break in, but like get that, on their radar and get your name sort of like associated with the firm to where you're helping them out on some sort of like, more permanent basis where you're like, sourcing consistent deal flow for them. And then eventually, the people that they're going to want to hire are the people that are bringing them good deals. And so if you've done that, for, 2, 3 months, and now you're at month 6 now, they're, going to want to, probably bring you on full time, or, you can have that conversation with them at least. Or, worst case, you have this like amazing scouting experience and you have this really good connection, and, they might be able to like introduce you to someone who they know is like hiring an analyst. So I think, do that, build really deep relationships, become sort of like a pseudo expert on like something you're interested in. Um, do the work, put it to paper, and then ultimately, something will sort of like come about it. But I think, network like crazy is sort of the bottom line.
And there it is. Now for a few rapid fire questions to wrap up. A few words or one sentence. Ready?
Ready.
If you could invest in any startup from the past, which one would it be?
Ooh, that's a good question. I am going to say Mercor. I think that that's an interesting one. I think that those founders are super young and super hungry, and they're growing incredibly fast. I think they might even be like the fastest growing company ever from like a revenue perspective. They started out kind of actually like in the AI, HR, hiring, recruiting standpoint. They kind of pivoted to more sort of like data labeling, scale, AI, surge sort of vibes, but still have this like large network of kind of like contractors or like expert, network type people. And training, they have all the best clients now. They're working with these huge AI labs like Meta, Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, who are all using their data and training their models based off of Mercor's sort of service. And I think sky's the limit for them. They've already grown a ton, and so yeah, needless to say, it would have been great to be like in their seed round or something.
What is maybe one public facing startup that you would back right now? And by public facing, I mean like maybe even on social media.
SpaceX. So yeah, I'm a big Elon supporter from like a company standpoint. I think he's generational. Obviously Tesla, Neuralink, SpaceX, XAI, which Mangusta, is an investor in XAI. So, I think he's doing incredible things. I think the way that he sort of has this network of companies and has them all sort of like overlap and intertwine is like a really, really powerful, web that he's built and crafted. I think SpaceX is super interesting because they really don't have like any direct competitors. I think Neuralink is an incredible business. The last I saw, they were doing, like 15 billion of revenue just from or sorry, Starlink, sorry. Starlink was doing 15 billion of revenue just on their own. And that doesn't get into any of the sort of like rocket, sort of like government contracted work that SpaceX do that's also under that umbrella. So I think if you believe that Elon can kind of like execute on any of his goals for like data centers in space or like rockets to Mars and like civilization on Mars eventually, I think SpaceX could be like a 5 trillion, $10 trillion company, which is pretty crazy to think about. Because Starlink is already like an amazing business model on its own. And I think anything Elon does is public facing, going to get criticism, going to get praise. But yeah, SpaceX to the moon, to the Mars, no pun intended there. Yeah.
How did you guys get into the XAI round, and which round was it?
Yeah, it was their Series B, and it was through Kevin's network and Luxottica and sort of relationships that he had built with the company. So ended up getting direct access there, which was pretty great. And the company's obviously crushed it since we got in a while back.
Amazing. And what is one fun fact about you most people don't know?
I'm an avid tennis and paddle player. So yeah, grew up, sort of always playing tennis. Now paddle is the sort of like rave in Miami, and I like to play all the time. It's a good workout, super social, good way to actually network and meet people. It's a really interesting sport because it brings in like a lot of demographics as well too, especially in Miami. It's really popular in like Europe and South America. So like a big Latin population, also, fairly like affluent sport as well too. So, brings that ex-athletes. So really kind of like warps in a ton of different demographics. And I really enjoy playing it for meeting the people and also just, for working out and kind of getting that, sports sort of fixed because I've always played sports my whole life. So love it.
And is there any thoughts you want to finish or we didn't get to cover on this pod that you would like to talk about?
I will say we do have a scout program as well too, which I think is sort of unique or interesting. It's mostly individuals, like young individuals that are at university, some of the top sort of universities, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, and whatnot, but then also includes some like really great sort of like current or ex-founders as well too. And so I think that's a cool way to get deal flow and get people really at the earliest stages, kind of like talent scouting, especially at these universities where, if one of our scouts at, XYZ university says, oh, this is the most like sort of like brilliant person I know, he's building this, we can kind of meet with him before maybe he ever even thinks or knows about venture funding. And then, if he's 6 months, a year and a half down the line, he's raising a seed or Series A. He knows us. He knows us on a personal level. He knows what we can provide. And so I think that's a cool way of getting to deals really early. And so if you're, interested in venture and you can source really good deals, you can get my contact or message me on LinkedIn or something. And, maybe for the next sort of cohort of scouts, you might be able to be a part of it.
Yeah. And on that note, does your fund have like a timeline on that program, scouting program, or even hiring for roles right now?
We're not hiring for any full-time roles right now. Potentially could use an intern or two. It's just like a part-time basis. Scout program usually runs for sort of 6 months, but people that do a really good job and like it, they can, keep doing it. We're not going to, kick people off if they're putting in work and sourcing great deals. We love to have more of those people, but I think we're going to actually soon sort of like recycle and start like a new cohort of scouts, because it's been about 6 months now since we did like the first sort of like initial scout wave. And we may even rework it. So before we focused like strictly kind of like on university students, we may sort of like try to work in some people with like other backgrounds as well too this time.
Yeah, that was amazing, Natali. For anyone listening who wants to learn more about you or your firm, what's the best place to reach you?
Yeah, mangustacap.com is our website. For me, you can check me out on LinkedIn. It's just my name, Natoli Farber. Instagram too, if you want to follow me there. I don't post much, but I'm there. So yeah, any of those sort of mediums.
And out of everyone you know, who are two amazing VCs that you would recommend as future guests to our podcast?
Ooh, have you guys ever done anything with Alumni Ventures? I think they have a kind of cool platform where they take sort of like follow-on positions into like a lot of different companies. So I think it's cool. So Brian Liu is a great guy there, and I think they have like a unique strategy. I would say another one would be Evan Shen from Left Lane. Left Lane is sort of like a Insight Partners spin out. They do a lot of like Series A, B, C consumer AI tilt companies. Amazing firm, been in a lot of great deals, and Evan is super bright and a great person.
That's amazing. And for the people listening, yes, we do have a partner from Alumni Ventures coming up. The episode is not published yet, but it's coming up. So thank you again. And thanks to everyone who's listening. Comment a question you want to hear from Tali or our next guest. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to press the subscribe button, like, and share with someone who's interested in getting into venture. We'll see you next time on Break into VC.